You have 48 hours to vacate this property or we're changing the locks. That's what three strangers in cheap suits told me when they showed up at my door, claiming I owed $47,000 in HOA fines for violations I'd never committed. The woman in charge shoved fake legal documents in my face while her two cronies blocked my driveway with their idling black SUV, diesel smoke mixing with Colorado autumn air. I'm Jake Mercer, retired Navy SEAL, 20 years Special Operations. I'd been peacefully renovating my inherited ranch house in Pinewood Springs for 8 months, but as I held their obviously photocopied seizure notice, every instinct I'd developed hunting terrorists started screaming warnings. The paper still smelled like fresh toner, the badges looked like Halloween costumes, and this woman's hands were shaking. They picked the wrong house. They had no idea what kind of hell they'd just unleashed. What would you do if strangers tried to steal your house with fake papers? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I bet your HOA has some stories too. Let me back up and tell you how this nightmare started. My name's Jake Mercer, 45 years old, retired Navy SEAL with 20 years of special operations under my belt. An IED in Afghanistan left me with a slight limp and a medical discharge, but my mind stayed sharp as a blade. 8 months ago, I inherited my Uncle Roy's modest ranch house in Pinewood Springs, Colorado, population 3,200, where everybody knows everybody's business. I'd moved there for the peace. After 2 decades of hunting bad guys in places most people can't pronounce, I craved quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, the smell of sawdust from renovation projects, and neighbors who minded their own business. My calloused hands had traded rifle grips for hammer handles, and I was good with that trade. Uncle Roy's place needed work. The deck boards were rotted through, kitchen cabinets hadn't seen paint since the Carter administration, and the bathroom looked like a crime scene. But it was mine, paid in full, with a clear title and no mortgage. I had my VA disability, my savings, and time to make it perfect. That's when Veronica Blackwood entered my life like a bad rash. Picture this, a 52-year-old woman who'd moved from Denver suburbs and immediately appointed herself the unofficial Community Standards Coordinator. She drove a white BMW that she parked like she owned the road, always wore beige blazers that screamed middle management, and carried a leather portfolio stuffed with complaint forms she'd printed at home. The woman had the personality of a parking meter and twice the attitude. Week 1 after I started renovations, I got my first violation notice. Apparently, fixing rotted deck boards constituted unauthorized construction in Veronica's twisted universe. The notice demanded a $500 fine and threatened escalated enforcement action if I didn't comply within 72 hours. The paper smelled like cheap printer ink and legal intimidation. Week 3 brought another gem. My grass was 3.2 inches tall. The community standard was supposedly 3 inches maximum. Another $500, please, and thank you. I measured my lawn with a ruler just to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. Spoiler alert, the woman was certifiably nuts. By week 6, she'd escalated to claiming my Ford F-150 was a commercial vehicle violating residential parking restrictions. It's a standard pickup truck, people. The kind half of Colorado drives to work every morning. But in Veronica's world, anything that didn't fit her suburban fantasy was a federal crime. Here's the thing that really got under my skin. Each notice came with official-looking letterhead claiming authority from the Pinewood Springs Homeowners Association. Problem was, I'd done my homework when I inherited the house. There was no HOA on my street, no recorded covenants, no association fees, no legitimate authority whatsoever. This woman was running a complete scam operation. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, a sweet Korean War veteran's widow who baked cookies that could end international conflicts, pulled me aside during week 7. "Jake," she whispered, glancing around like we were planning a prison break. "That woman's been terrorizing folks for months. The Hendersons on Oak Street paid her $1,800 just to make her stop calling the city about their garden gnomes." Mrs. Chen's weathered hands shook as she spoke. This wasn't just annoying harassment. Veronica was genuinely frightening vulnerable people in our community. The scent of Mrs. Chen's homemade chocolate chip cookies couldn't mask the fear in her voice. That's when I realized this wasn't about property maintenance or community standards. This was about a predator who'd found a hunting ground full of elderly residents and newcomers who didn't know their rights. She was using fake authority and legal-sounding threats to steal money from decent people. Lou, our mailman, confirmed my suspicions when he stopped by during week 8. "Never delivered any official HOA documents to your address, Jake," he said, adjusting his postal cap. "And I've been walking this route for 12 years. If there was a legitimate homeowners association, I'd know about it." That's when I knew Veronica Blackwood had made a critical error in target selection. She'd decided to mess with someone who'd spent 20 years dealing with people who thought they were above the law. She was about to learn the difference between real authority and playground bullying. 3 days after my conversation with Lou, Veronica returned with reinforcements. I was replacing a broken window pane when I heard car doors slamming in my driveway, not one car, but two. The sound of gravel crunching under multiple footsteps told me this wasn't a social call. Through the glass, I watched Veronica climb out of her BMW wearing her signature beige blazer, followed by two men I'd never seen before. The first guy looked like her brother-in-law Rick, mid-40s, soft around the middle, wearing a wrinkled button-down that screamed middle management crisis. The second was his buddy Darren, a lanky guy with nervous energy who kept checking his phone like he expected the FBI to call any minute. Both carried clipboards and wore cheap plastic badges that looked like they'd come from a costume shop. The autumn air carried Veronica's excessive perfume, something floral that probably cost more than most people's car payments, mixed with the diesel exhaust from Rick's idling pickup truck. She knocked on my door like she was serving an eviction notice. "Mr. Mercer," she announced when I opened up, "I'm here with the HOA enforcement team. Your property is now under emergency management due to persistent violations and failure to comply with community standards." Rick stepped forward, puffing out his chest like a rooster. "Sir, we need immediate payment of $5,000 as a compliance deposit, or we'll be forced to initiate asset seizure procedures within 48 hours. I leaned against my doorframe, keeping my voice calm. In Afghanistan, I'd learned that staying cool under pressure made enemies reveal their weaknesses faster than any interrogation technique. Asset seizure procedures? That sounds serious. Which court issued the order? Darren fumbled through his clipboard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. The papers rustled like dry leaves as his hands trembled. "Well, it's not exactly a court order per se, but rather a community enforcement action authorized under the Homeowners Association bylaws and—" "Which bylaws?" I interrupted. "I'd like to see the recorded covenants for this neighborhood." Veronica's face flushed red. "Don't you dare question legitimate authority. We have full legal standing to enforce community standards, and your continued violations are affecting property values for every decent family in this neighborhood." That's when I decided to have some fun. My old Navy buddy Mike had become a real estate lawyer after his service, and during our last beer session, he'd explained exactly how property covenants worked. Time to put that knowledge to use. "Ma'am, I spent 20 years following legitimate authority in some of the world's most dangerous places. I'm very familiar with how real authority operates." I stepped closer, my voice dropping to the tone I'd used interrogating terrorists. "Which section of the county building code requires pre-1980 homes to have vinyl siding?" Silence. Rick and Darren exchanged glances like school kids caught cheating on a test. The smell of their nervous sweat mixed with Veronica's perfume created an almost comical combination. "I'm not here to debate technicalities," Veronica snapped. "Either you pay the compliance deposit now, or we change the locks tomorrow morning." "With what authority?" I asked, pulling out my phone. "And gentlemen, I hope you don't mind me recording this conversation for my records." The effect was immediate and beautiful. Darren took 2 steps backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. Rick's clipboard started shaking in his hands like a leaf in a windstorm, but Veronica doubled down with the desperation of someone whose entire scam was crumbling. "You can't record us without permission. That's illegal." I smiled the same smile I'd worn when cornering insurgents who thought they were smarter than American special forces. "Actually, ma'am, Colorado is a one-party consent state. I can record any conversation I'm participating in." After they left, trailing empty threats and muttered curses, I got to work. Military intelligence training doesn't just disappear because you change careers. I photographed their license plates, ran the registrations, and discovered something interesting. Rick worked at Kinko's Copy Center on Main Street, the same place where all their official documents had that distinctive fresh toner smell. But the real bombshell came when Lou stopped by during his next mail run. "Jake, I did some checking like you asked. Turns out Rick's been coming into the copy shop after hours for the past 6 months, using the machines when his manager isn't around. And get this, He's been paying cash for everything. Mrs. Chen's revelation over coffee was even better. Her kitchen smelled like cinnamon and old wood polish, but her news was pure gold. That horrible woman tried the same thing on 3 other houses. The Millers were so scared they moved away last month. But here's the thing, Jake. I saw her collecting money from Mr. Thompson, and she put it straight into her purse. No receipt, no official paperwork, just cash in her pocket. That's when I realized Veronica Blackwood had made the classic mistake every criminal I'd ever hunted eventually made. She'd gotten greedy and sloppy. 2 weeks later, Veronica decided to bring out the big guns, or at least what she thought were big guns. I was installing new kitchen countertops when I heard a commotion outside that made my blood run cold. Not because I was scared, but because I recognized the sound of someone impersonating law enforcement badly. Through my window, I watched a patrol car pull up behind Veronica's BMW. Except something was off about that squad car. The paint job looked fresh, the light bar seemed crooked, and the deputy who climbed out moved like he'd never worn a uniform in his life. When he turned around, I nearly laughed out loud. It was Rick, stuffed into what looked like a Halloween costume version of a sheriff's deputy uniform. The polyester fabric strained against his beer gut, and his badge was pinned on crooked. But the real giveaway was his shoes. Rick was wearing brown loafers instead of black duty boots. Any real cop would rather die than commit that fashion crime. Veronica marched up to my door with Rick trailing behind like an overgrown lapdog. She held up an official-looking document that smelled like fresh printer ink mixed with desperation. "Mr. Mercer, this is Deputy Richardson from the County Sheriff's Department. We have a court order for your immediate evacuation from this property." Rick straightened his fake uniform and tried to deepen his voice. "Sir, you need to vacate these premises within 24 hours, or face arrest for contempt of court." I opened my door wider and studied them both. In Iraq, I'd learned to spot fake documents and impersonators from 50 yards away. These two weren't even close to convincing. "Deputy Richardson, could I see your badge number and department identification?" Rick's face went pale beneath his cheap aviator sunglasses. "Well, that's not really necessary since we have the court order and—" "Every law enforcement officer in Colorado carries official identification," I said, pulling out my phone. "Mind if I verify your employment with the sheriff's department?" The silence stretched like taffy. Rick's fake uniform was already showing sweat stains under the arms, and Veronica's left eye had developed a nervous twitch that would have been hilarious if it weren't so pathetic. That evening, Veronica pulled her next move. She'd reserved the community room at the local library and invited neighbors for what she called a community standards hearing. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as about 15 residents filed in, most looking confused about why they were there. I arrived fashionably late, just as Veronica was explaining how my refusal to comply with basic community standards was threatening everyone's property values. She'd set up a makeshift podium and wore her most official-looking blazer, the one that made her look like a funeral director with authority issues. "This man has repeatedly violated our neighborhood covenants," she announced, pointing at me like I'd personally insulted her mother. "He refuses to maintain proper lawn height, operates unauthorized construction without permits, and parks commercial vehicles in residential areas." I raised my hand. "Ma'am, could you show us these neighborhood covenants? I'd love to see the recorded documents." Her face flushed red. "These matters don't require—" "Actually, they do." I stood up, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned commanding teams in combat zones. "Colorado law requires all homeowner association rules to be recorded with property deeds. I checked with the county clerk this afternoon. No covenants exist for our neighborhood." Old Mr. Thompson, who'd paid Veronica $2,300 for mailbox violations, suddenly looked like a man who'd been slapped awake. "You mean I didn't have to pay those fines?" That's when the dam broke. Mrs. Henderson stood up, her voice shaking with anger. "She made us pay $1,800 for our garden gnomes, said they violated height restrictions." Young Maria Santos from Oak Street chimed in, $1,500 for having the wrong color mailbox. The room erupted in angry voices as neighbors realized they'd been systematically robbed by a woman in a cheap blazer. But Veronica wasn't done yet. She tried to restore order by bringing Rick back into the room, still wearing his ridiculous fake uniform. "Deputy Richardson will explain the legal consequences of ignoring community standards," she announced desperately. I smiled and pulled out my phone. Actually, I called the real sheriff's department this afternoon. Deputy Martinez is on his way over to meet Deputy Richardson. Should be interesting. Rick's face went white as hospital sheets. He mumbled something about a family emergency and practically sprinted for the exit, his fake badge jangling like loose change as he fled. 5 minutes later, real Deputy Martinez walked in. A young guy, sharp uniform, actual authority radiating from every step. He took one look around the room, then at me, and nodded. "Mr. Mercer, you're the Navy SEAL who called about the impersonation?" The taste of victory was sweeter than Mrs. Chen's homemade cookies. After her public humiliation at the library, Veronica went nuclear. The woman had clearly never learned the first rule of warfare. When you're losing, don't double down on stupid. But that's exactly what she did. 3 days later, I was welding a new porch railing when Deputy Martinez showed up at my door, looking uncomfortable. The smell of hot metal and welding fumes mixed with his cologne as he approached, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. "Jake, I hate to bother you, but we received a complaint that needs to be investigated." He pulled out his notepad, clearly not enjoying this conversation. "Veronica Blackwood filed a report claiming you threatened her with physical violence. She's requesting a restraining order." I set down my welding torch and pulled off my mask, the cool October air hitting my sweaty face. "What exactly am I supposed to have threatened?" "She claims you used your military background to intimidate her, made references to hunting people like her, and implied you had weapons training that made you dangerous to the community." Martinez looked embarrassed reading the charges. "Look, Jake, I served 2 tours in Afghanistan myself. I know the difference between a threat and a statement of fact, but I have to follow up on every complaint." That afternoon, I found myself in Judge Patricia Coleman's courtroom, watching Veronica perform what could only be described as amateur theater. She'd dressed in all black like she was attending a funeral, complete with tissues that she dabbed at her dry eyes for dramatic effect. "Your Honor," she sobbed into the microphone, "this man is clearly suffering from combat-related mental instability. He bragged about hunting terrorists and implied he could make me disappear. I fear for my safety and the safety of every family in our neighborhood." Judge Coleman had been on the bench for 23 years and had seen every variety of performance art masquerading as legal testimony. She looked at Veronica with the expression of someone who'd just stepped in something unpleasant. "Ms. Blackwood, do you have any evidence of these alleged threats? Recordings, witnesses, written communications?" Veronica's hands fluttered like nervous birds. "Well, not exactly evidence per se, but the implied threats were very clear to anyone who understood military terminology, and I'll take that as a no." Judge Coleman turned to me. "Mr. Mercer, would you like to respond to these allegations?" I stood up, keeping my voice calm and respectful. During my 20 years of service, I'd testified in dozens of military tribunals and learned that judges appreciate brevity and facts. "Your Honor, I've never threatened Ms. Blackwood or anyone else. I did inform her that I was familiar with legitimate authority, having served under it for 2 decades. I also mentioned that I knew the difference between real law enforcement and people playing dress-up." I pulled out my phone and played the recording from our library encounter. Veronica's voice filled the courtroom as she tried to silence angry neighbors, followed by Rick's panicked exit when I mentioned the real deputy's arrival. Judge Coleman listened to the entire recording, her eyebrows climbing higher with each ridiculous exchange. When it finished, she looked at Veronica like she'd found a snake in her garden. "Ms. Blackwood, this recording indicates that you've been collecting money from residents under false pretenses and using someone to impersonate a law enforcement officer. Are you aware that both activities constitute serious criminal offenses?" The courtroom was so quiet you could hear Veronica's nervous breathing echoing off the walls. Her tissues had stopped their dramatic dabbing, and her face had gone the color of old parchment. "Your Honor, I was simply trying to maintain community standards and—" "Your restraining order request is denied," Judge Coleman interrupted. "Furthermore, I'm forwarding a copy of this recording to the District Attorney's Office for review. Mr. Mercer, thank you for your service, and I apologize for wasting your time with this frivolous complaint." But Veronica's desperation led to her biggest mistake yet. While I was in court, defending myself against her fantasy threats, she'd recruited 2 new accomplices, guys who looked like they'd been hired from the criminals for rent section of Craigslist. They showed up at my house claiming to be property assessors while I was gone, asking Mrs. Chen detailed questions about my renovation work and trying to peek into my windows. What they didn't know was that my Uncle Roy, paranoid old coot that he was, had installed a military-grade security system that would make Fort Knox jealous. Every angle of my property was covered by cameras that recorded in high definition, complete with audio and night vision capabilities. When I reviewed the footage that evening, watching these clowns case my house while discussing which violations to plant as evidence, I realized Veronica had just handed me the smoking gun I needed. She'd crossed the line from petty fraud into criminal conspiracy and apparently had no idea that breaking and entering a veteran's property was about as smart as kicking a sleeping grizzly bear. Time to show her what real consequences looked like. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about Veronica's operation felt bigger than petty neighborhood harassment. In 20 years of special operations, I'd learned to trust my instincts when they whispered that I was only seeing the tip of the iceberg. So I did what any good intelligence officer does when the pieces don't fit. I went digging. The county records office opened at 8 a.m. sharp. I was there at 7:50, clutching a thermos of black coffee and wearing my most patient expression. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Beverly who'd probably processed every property transaction in the county for the past decade, greeted me with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved her job. "What can I help you find today, hon?" "I need to research any liens or encumbrances filed against properties in the Pinewood Springs area over the past year," I said, sliding my property description across her counter. Beverly's fingers flew across her computer keyboard with the precision of a concert pianist. The screen filled with legal documents, filing numbers, and dates that painted a picture more horrifying than anything I'd encountered in combat zones. "Oh my," Beverly murmured, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the records. "This is highly unusual. There are 23 properties with recent lien filings, all from the same source." My blood went cold as she pulled up document after document. Veronica hadn't just been collecting fake fines from neighbors. She'd been filing fraudulent liens against their properties. Each lien claimed unpaid HOA assessments, violation penalties, and legal fees ranging from $5,000 to $15,000. But the real gut punch came when Beverly showed me the next layer. "These liens are all connected to a company called Pinewood Property Solutions. Says here they've been purchasing distressed properties at tax sales and foreclosure auctions." I stared at the screen, my military training connecting dots that formed a picture uglier than a Taliban ambush. "Beverly, who owns Pinewood Property Solutions?" Her fingers clicked through corporate filings, and there it was. Veronica Blackwood, listed under her maiden name, Veronica Steele. The company had been registered 6 months ago, right around the time she'd started her fake HOA campaign. The scope of her operation hit me like a freight train. This wasn't random harassment or petty extortion. Veronica had been systematically targeting vulnerable homeowners, filing fraudulent liens to cloud their property titles, then positioning herself to buy their homes for pennies on the dollar when they couldn't sell or refinance. "Beverly, how many properties has Pinewood Property Solutions actually acquired?" "Let me check the deed transfers." Her face went pale as she scrolled through the records. 3 so far. The Miller property on Oak Street sold for $28,000 last month. Market value was listed at $260,000. My hands clenched into fists as I realized what had happened to the Millers, the elderly couple Mrs. Chen mentioned who'd been so terrorized they moved away. They hadn't just moved. They'd been forced to sell their home for a fraction of its value because Veronica's fraudulent liens made it impossible to get a clean title transfer. "There's more," Beverly continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "These lien filings show a co-conspirator at Riverside Title Company. Someone named Marcus Webb has been rubber stamping these fraudulent documents without proper verification." The pieces finally clicked into place. Veronica wasn't just some neighborhood busybody with delusions of authority. She was running a sophisticated real estate fraud scheme that had already stolen over $500,000 in property value from vulnerable residents. The fake HOA was just the front operation, designed to justify liens that would force people out of their homes. I thanked Beverly and walked out into the crisp morning air, my mind already shifting into tactical planning mode. This wasn't a job for local law enforcement anymore. This was organized crime, interstate fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft on a massive scale. Time to call in some old friends who specialized in taking down networks of criminals who thought they were too smart to get caught. Veronica Blackwood was about to discover that when you declare war on a Navy SEAL, you better be prepared for the full weight of American justice to come crashing down on your head. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with my secure phone and started making calls. The taste of strong coffee mixed with the satisfaction of finally understanding my enemy's true scope of operations. When you've spent 20 years dismantling terrorist networks, you learn that the key to victory isn't just superior firepower, it's superior intelligence and coordination. My first call went to Sarah Mitchell, a former naval intelligence officer who'd transitioned to the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force. We'd served together in Afghanistan, where she'd tracked terrorist funding networks with the same methodical precision she now used hunting white-collar criminals. "Jake Mercer, you old warhorse," her voice crackled through the encrypted connection. "Let me guess. You've stumbled into something that requires federal attention?" I explained Veronica's operation while pacing my kitchen, the smell of sawdust from my renovation work mixing with the aroma of Mrs. Chen's cookies she'd brought over earlier. Sarah's questions were sharp, professional, and told me everything I needed to know about how seriously the feds would take this case. Mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and organized criminal activity, she summarized after I'd laid out the evidence. Plus, if she's crossing state lines or using the internet for any of this, we can add federal jurisdiction. Send me everything you've got, Jake. This sounds like a RICO case waiting to happen. My second call went to Tom Rodriguez, a Marine veteran who'd become an investigative journalist for the Denver Post. Tom had made his career exposing corruption in small towns where criminals thought they were too isolated to attract attention. A fake HOA running real estate fraud? Tom's excitement was audible through the phone. "Jake, this is front-page material. How many victims are we talking about?" "At least 23 properties affected, 3 families already forced out of their homes," I replied, checking my notes. "And that's just what I found in one afternoon at the county records office." While I worked my professional contacts, Mrs. Chen had been busy organizing our neighborhood response. Her living room had transformed into a command center that would have impressed my old intelligence unit. Maps covered her coffee table, victim testimonies were organized in neat folders, and she'd created a timeline of Veronica's activities that belonged in a federal evidence room. "Jake, I've been talking to everyone Veronica targeted," Mrs. Chen said, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed her handwritten notes. The scent of green tea and determination filled her small living room. "Mr. Thompson documented every interaction, saved every fake notice. The Santos family has receipts for the money they paid. Even the Henderson's garden gnome violations are photographed and dated." Lou had turned his mail route into an intelligence-gathering operation. During his daily rounds, he'd quietly interviewed residents, documented which houses had received fake violation notices, and mapped out the geographic pattern of Veronica's targeting strategy. "She's been working systematically," Lou explained, spreading a hand-drawn map across Mrs. Chen's dining table. "Started with elderly residents living alone, then moved to newcomers who didn't know the neighborhood history. Classic predator behavior. Isolate the vulnerable first." Deputy Martinez provided the law enforcement perspective during an unofficial visit to my workshop. The smell of WD-40 and metal shavings filled the air as I organized my evidence files on my workbench. "Jake, I can't get directly involved in the investigation, but I can tell you that federal agents asking questions carries a lot more weight than local complaints," he said, keeping his voice low. "If your FBI friend opens a case, every law enforcement agency in Colorado will suddenly become very helpful very quickly." The breakthrough came when Tom's journalistic investigation uncovered Veronica's history. She'd run similar scams in Arizona and New Mexico before moving to Colorado, always targeting small communities where residents didn't have easy access to legal resources. "Phoenix police have a file on her from 2019, Tom reported during our evening phone call. "Similar operation, different name. She got away clean when victims couldn't afford to pursue civil litigation." My old Army buddy Mike, who'd become a real estate attorney, provided the legal strategy that would nail down our case. During our video call, he explained the multiple federal crimes Veronica had committed with each fraudulent lien filing. "The beauty of federal jurisdiction is that it doesn't matter if she moves states or changes identities," Mike said, his law office visible behind him on the screen. "Once the feds have jurisdiction, they can follow the money trail anywhere it leads." By the end of the week, we had assembled what military tacticians call overwhelming force advantage. Federal investigators, professional journalists, documented victims, and local law enforcement all aligned against a target who still thought she was just dealing with a grumpy veteran and some scared neighbors. Time to spring the trap and watch Veronica Blackwood discover that American justice, when properly motivated, moves with the unstoppable momentum of an avalanche. Veronica must have sensed the walls closing in, because her next moves reeked of desperation. When predators realize they've been exposed, they don't retreat gracefully. They lash out with the fury of cornered animals. I'd seen this behavior in insurgent leaders who knew their networks were compromised, and the pattern never changed: escalate, intimidate, and burn everything down rather than face consequences. Her first desperate gambit arrived on a Tuesday morning via certified mail. I was replacing rotted fence posts when Lou delivered an envelope thick enough to choke a horse. Inside was a formal lawsuit claiming I'd damaged her BMW during our library confrontation, complete with fabricated witness statements and doctored photographs showing scratches that definitely hadn't existed during our encounter. The smell of fresh legal ink mixed with the autumn air as I read through her amateur hour legal fiction. According to the complaint, I'd aggressively confronted her in the library parking lot, used military intimidation tactics, and deliberately keyed her car while making threats about what happens to people who cross Navy SEALs. Pure fantasy, but expensive fantasy. She was demanding $15,000 in damages plus attorney fees, clearly hoping I'd settle rather than fight a prolonged legal battle. But Veronica's real desperation showed in her next move. 3 days later, Mrs. Chen called me at 6 a.m., her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and outrage. "Jake, someone vandalized Mr. Thompson's mailbox last night, spray-painted snitch across it in red letters, and there's a note stuffed inside threatening him to keep his mouth shut about neighborhood business." I drove over to find Mr. Thompson standing in his driveway, staring at the destruction, with the hollow expression of someone who'd thought he was safe in his own neighborhood. The paint was still tacky to the touch, and the chemical smell burned my nostrils as I examined the damage. "They came around midnight," he said, his elderly hands trembling as he held the threatening note. "Heard car doors slamming, but by the time I looked out the window, they were gone. The note says if I talk to any more reporters or government people, next time it won't just be the mailbox." That same week, the Santos family found their tires slashed and move away scratched into their car's paint. The Hendersons discovered their garden gnomes, the same ones Veronica had fined them for, smashed to pieces and scattered across their lawn like ceramic confetti. But Veronica's biggest mistake was underestimating the network I'd been quietly building. While she was playing amateur hour intimidation games, Sarah Mitchell had been conducting a federal investigation that made Watergate look like a parking ticket. "Jake, your neighborhood friends have been busy," Sarah reported during our secure call. "We've intercepted communications between Veronica and her Denver associates. Turns out this operation extends beyond real estate fraud. They're also running mortgage scams and identity theft rings in 3 states. The intercepted phone calls revealed the scope of Veronica's panic. She'd been pressuring her accomplices to accelerate the timeline and secure assets before the investigation spreads. In criminal speak, that meant she was planning to grab whatever money she could and disappear before federal agents came knocking. Meanwhile, Tom Rodriguez's investigative journalism had attracted attention from other news outlets. The Denver Post's initial story about small-town real estate fraud had gone viral, drawing responses from victims in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah who recognized Veronica's methods. "This is becoming a multi-state criminal enterprise story," Tom explained during our coffee meeting at the local diner. The smell of bacon grease and brewing coffee filled the air as he showed me emails from dozens of potential victims. "FBI's Joint Task Force on Organized Crime has taken over the investigation. Your neighborhood complaint just became a federal case." But Veronica's most dangerous escalation came when she tried to bribe her way out of trouble. Deputy Martinez called me Thursday evening, his voice tight with professional anger. "Jake, I need to report an attempted bribery. Veronica Blackwood approached me this afternoon, offered me $10,000 to lose some paperwork and forget about our conversations regarding her activities." The recording Martinez had made of their encounter was beautiful in its stupidity. Veronica's voice clear as crystal, offering cash payments to a law enforcement officer in exchange for obstruction of justice. She'd just added federal bribery charges to her growing list of crimes. That night, I sat on my completed front porch, listening to the sounds of my neighborhood settling into evening routines. The smell of someone's barbecued dinner drifted across the cool air, mixed with the scent of Mrs. Chen's jasmine tea from her kitchen window. Tomorrow, Sarah Mitchell's FBI team would arrive to begin formal interviews and evidence collection. Tom Rodriguez had scheduled his follow-up story for the weekend edition, and Veronica Blackwood, who'd thought she was smart enough to terrorize vulnerable people without consequences, was about to discover that American justice moves slowly but hits harder than a freight train. By Friday morning, Veronica had reached full desperation mode. I was installing new cabinet hardware when my doorbell rang with the aggressive persistence of someone who'd run out of options. Through the peephole, I could see her standing alone on my porch. No Rick, no Darren, no fake deputies, just a woman whose criminal empire was crumbling faster than a sandcastle in a hurricane. She'd traded her usual beige blazer for something that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. A designer suit that screamed, "I'm about to flee the country." Her hands shook as she clutched a thick manila envelope, and the smell of expensive perfume couldn't mask the scent of pure panic radiating from her pores. "Mr. Mercer," she said when I opened the door, her voice artificially sweet, like artificial sweetener mixed with desperation. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. I'd like to make this right between us." I leaned against my doorframe, keeping my expression neutral. In interrogation training, we'd learned that desperate people reveal more when you let them talk themselves into deeper holes. "Make what right, exactly?" She opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of $100 bills thick enough to choke a horse. $10,000 cash, no strings attached, just a neighborly gesture to show there are no hard feelings about our misunderstandings. The bills were crisp, new, still smelling like bank teller counters and criminal proceeds. "That's generous of you, Ms. Blackwood. What exactly would I be doing to earn this neighborly gesture?" Her left eye developed that nervous twitch again. "Nothing at all, just maybe you could see your way clear to dropping any complaints you might have filed. Let bygones be bygones. Move forward as friendly neighbors." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "So, you're offering me $10,000 to drop criminal complaints against you?" The color drained from her face faster than water from a punctured bucket. "That's not... I never said criminal complaints. I just meant neighborhood disputes, and, ma'am, attempted bribery is a federal crime, especially when it's aimed at obstructing an ongoing FBI investigation." She stumbled backward like I'd slapped her, the cash spilling from her hands and scattering across my porch like confetti at a very expensive, very illegal party. Without another word, she fled to her BMW and peeled out of my driveway, leaving behind enough evidence to add bribery charges to her already impressive criminal resume. But Veronica's final gambit was her most vicious. That afternoon, my phone started buzzing with concerned calls from neighbors. Someone had created fake social media profiles claiming to be military veterans, posting detailed accusations that I was suffering from PTSD, had threatened multiple neighbors with violence, and was stockpiling weapons while planning some kind of revenge against the community. The posts included doctored photos showing me in military gear, fake quotes about eliminating threats to operational security, and fabricated witness statements from neighbors who claimed to fear for their safety. Within hours, the posts had been shared hundreds of times across Facebook and Twitter, painting me as an unstable veteran ticking toward violence. Mrs. Chen showed up at my door that evening, her face flushed with anger and a plate of stress-baked cookies in her hands. "Jake, this is absolutely ridiculous. Anyone who knows you would see through this garbage immediately." The smell of her homemade chocolate chip cookies mixed with my growing fury as I scrolled through the fake posts on her tablet. Veronica had crossed every possible line, but attacking my military service and endangering my neighbor's trust was personal in ways she couldn't comprehend. "She's trying to isolate you," Mrs. Chen continued, settling into my kitchen chair with the determination of someone who'd seen enough injustice for one lifetime. Classic bully tactic. Destroy your credibility before people discover her crimes. But Veronica had made a crucial error. The fake social media campaign included specific details about military operations and classified information that no civilian could have known. When Sarah Mitchell reviewed the posts, her reaction was swift and professionally lethal. "Jake, whoever created these posts had access to information that's only available through military personnel records or intelligence files," Sarah explained during our secure call. "That means either someone with security clearance is helping her, or she's committed federal crimes accessing classified databases." The digital forensics team traced the fake accounts back to computers in Denver, linking them directly to the same criminal network that had been running Veronica's real estate fraud scheme. What she'd intended as a character assassination had instead provided federal investigators with ironclad evidence of cybercrime, identity theft, and misuse of military records. Tom Rodriguez's follow-up story ran that weekend with the headline, "Local Real Estate Fraud Expands into Federal Cybercrime Case." The article detailed how a simple neighborhood dispute had uncovered a multi-state criminal organization that had defrauded hundreds of families out of millions in property value. Sunday evening, Sarah called with news that made my coffee taste sweeter than Mrs. Chen's cookies. Federal arrest warrants have been issued. We're moving tomorrow morning. Hope you're ready for some fireworks, Jake. 20 years of military service had taught me to appreciate the sound of justice incoming, like artillery support. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of mountain air and the promise of long overdue justice. Veronica had called an emergency town hall meeting at the Pinewood Springs Community Center, billing it as a public safety forum regarding dangerous veteran behavior in our neighborhood. She'd invited local media, county officials, and anyone who'd listened to her final performance. What she didn't know was that FBI agents Sarah Mitchell and James Torres had driven down from Denver the night before, along with Tom Rodriguez and a camera crew from Channel 9 News. The community center parking lot looked like a law enforcement convention by 9 a.m., with unmarked federal vehicles parked strategically around the building. Inside, the community center buzzed with tension thick enough to cut with a combat knife. Veronica had positioned herself at the front podium, flanked by Rick and two new guys who looked like they'd been hired from the Thugs R Us catalog. She wore her most expensive suit and carried herself with the desperate confidence of someone making their final stand. About 200 residents packed the folding chairs, their conversations creating a low murmur that reminded me of the calm before artillery strikes. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, her hands folded peacefully but her eyes sharp as laser sights. Lou had positioned himself near the back exit, while Deputy Martinez stood along the side wall in full uniform, his presence lending official weight to the proceedings. Veronica began her presentation like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. She'd prepared a slideshow complete with photos of my house, close-ups of my truck, and dramatic recreations of our various encounters. The smell of nervous sweat and cheap cologne from her hired muscle mixed with the coffee and donuts someone had provided for the gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice artificially steady, "we're here because a dangerous individual has been terrorizing our peaceful community. This man has used his military training to intimidate residents, threatened violence against anyone who questions his behavior, and created an atmosphere of fear that threatens our property values and our children's safety." She clicked through her slides, each one more ridiculous than the last. Photos of my renovation work labeled as unauthorized construction. Pictures of my lawn with measurements claiming it violated community standards. Even a shot of my American flag, somehow portrayed as evidence of militant behavior. "Military veterans suffering from combat trauma can become unpredictable and violent," she continued, warming to her theme like a snake oil salesman hitting his stride. "This man has repeatedly referenced his training in killing and his experience hunting human beings. He's turned our neighborhood into a war zone." That's when I stood up from my seat in the middle section. The room went quiet except for the soft whir of news cameras turning in my direction. I walked calmly to the front, my boots clicking on the linoleum floor with the measured pace I'd learned approaching hostile interrogation subjects. "Ma'am, thank you for organizing this gathering," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded troops in actual war zones. "You're absolutely right that we have a community problem. You are that problem." I pulled out a manila folder thick with documents and approached the podium. Veronica's face went pale as parchment as I spread county records, bank statements, and federal investigation summaries across her presentation table. "Ladies and gentlemen, Veronica Blackwood has been operating a criminal enterprise designed to steal your homes through fraudulent liens and fake HOA violations. She's already forced 3 families out of their properties, collecting over $200,000 through organized fraud." The room erupted in angry murmurs as I displayed the evidence. Bank records showing where the fake fine money went, corporate filings revealing her shell company, property transfer documents showing how she'd acquired the Miller house for a fraction of its value. "She filed 23 fraudulent liens against your properties," I continued, my voice cutting through the chaos. "She's been working with corrupt title company employees to cloud your property ownership, making it impossible for you to sell or refinance your homes." That's when Sarah Mitchell stood up from her seat near the back, her FBI credentials glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of the United States government. "We have warrants for the arrest of Veronica Blackwood, Richard Blackwood, and Marcus Webb on charges of mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and racketeering." The next 60 seconds unfolded like a choreographed dance. Federal agents moved from their positions around the room, handcuffs appearing with the precision of military operations. News cameras captured every moment as Veronica's hired thugs melted away like morning mist, leaving her standing alone at the podium, finally stripped of her fake authority. "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Torres announced as he placed handcuffs on Veronica's wrists. The clicking sound echoed through the stunned silence like a gavel falling on her criminal career. The community center erupted in applause that lasted 5 full minutes. Justice, when it finally arrives, sounds like thunder rolling across mountain peaks. 6 months later, I sat on my completed front porch with my morning coffee, watching the sun rise over the Rockies and listening to the sounds of a neighborhood that had rediscovered peace. The smell of fresh pine from my new deck boards mixed with the aroma of Mrs. Chen's homemade breakfast pastries drifting from her kitchen window. Children's laughter echoed from yards that had once been silent with fear. Veronica Blackwood had been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to 17 felony charges. The judge had been particularly unimpressed with her attempts to blame everything on misunderstandings and overzealous community involvement. Her final statement in court, claiming she was just trying to maintain property values, earned her an extra 6 months for perjury. Her accomplices received sentences ranging from 18 months to 3 years. Rick looked like a deflated balloon when they led him away in shackles, while Marcus Webb from the title company lost his license permanently and faced separate state charges. The Denver muscle she'd hired flipped on bigger fish, leading to a multi-state racketeering investigation that's still making headlines. The financial recovery exceeded everyone's expectations. Federal asset forfeiture laws allowed authorities to seize everything: Veronica's BMW, her Denver condo, jewelry, even her precious leather portfolio. Over $340,000 was distributed back to victims, with interest and penalties that left most families better off than before they'd met their... The Hendersons received compensation for both their fake fines and their destroyed garden gnomes, then through a gnome liberation party that became legendary neighborhood lore. Most importantly, the Miller family reclaimed their house after federal prosecutors proved their forced sale had been obtained through criminal fraud. Watching them move back into their home, seeing their grandchildren play in the yard again, reminded me why some battles are worth fighting regardless of personal cost. But the real victory was what our community built from the ashes of Veronica's scheme. Mrs. Chen's weekly coffee gatherings evolved into the Pinewood Springs Neighborhood Defense Network, a permanent watch program that protects vulnerable residents from scams and fraud. Lou's informal intelligence network became an official communication system using encrypted group messaging and scheduled check-ins for elderly neighbors. The recovered money from Veronica's criminal enterprise seeded the Pinewood Springs Community Defense Fund, which provides free legal consultation and sponsors our annual Unity Festival. Last month's festival drew over 800 people, with food trucks, live music, and educational booths teaching residents about their rights. The sight of families celebrating together in the same community center where Veronica had made her final stand was sweeter than any military victory I'd ever experienced. Deputy Martinez received a commendation and promotion to detective, now running training seminars across Colorado on recognizing property fraud. His expertise has helped expose similar schemes in 12 other towns, saving hundreds of families from Veronica's playbook. My kitchen table became an unofficial consultation center for veterans facing civilian legal challenges. Sarah Mitchell connected me with advocacy groups statewide, and I discovered that protecting fellow service members from predatory scams felt as meaningful as any mission I'd completed overseas. The investigation led to the Blackwood Act, state legislation requiring stricter verification for property liens and HOA claims. Tom Rodriguez's Pulitzer-nominated series on small-town fraud exposed the scope of these schemes nationwide, turning our local victory into national reform. On quiet evenings, I get calls from other veterans facing their own Veronicas. The network we built during our federal investigation has become an informal support system spanning multiple states. Last week, a retired Marine from Texas called about fake contractors. Next month, I'm helping an Army veteran in Arizona whose neighborhood faces fraudulent code enforcement. Mrs. Chen still delivers cookies weekly, now accompanied by updates on her volunteer work teaching fraud recognition. "Knowledge defeats bullies better than any weapon," she says, settling into my kitchen chair with the satisfaction of someone who's helped save an entire community. The sound of children playing safely, neighbors helping neighbors, and justice served reminds me daily that sometimes the most important battles happen right in your own backyard. Drop a comment sharing your worst HOA or neighborhood bully story right here on HOA Stories. You'd be amazed how common these situations are. Subscribe to HOA Stories and hit that notification bell, because next week I'm sharing how a retired teacher exposed a fake charity that stole $200,000 from hurricane victims and the FBI sting operation that brought them down.
That's all for today's HOA madness. If watching justice serve itself made your day, smash that like button, share your thoughts down below, and make sure you're subscribed. More outrageous neighborhood showdowns are just around the corner.